So continuing our discussion of characterizing waste, in addition to some of the chemical and physical parameters we discussed in the last videos, we also create our own categories for waste. So there's a few different streams that we'll talk about in the waste industry, and you're probably familiar with all of them. You just might not be familiar with the terms that are used in the industry. So in my slide here, there's a picture of some common things you might see out at the curb on your local garbage night. So the first thing we'll talk about is mixed waste. So you could also call this black bag waste. It's kind of your general waste. Before we had any diversion programs, we had only mixed waste. And one of the goals as solid waste engineers is to get things out of mixed waste and into dedicated streams where they can be treated with a waste appropriate technology instead of all going into the landfill. On the other side are all these source separated fractions. So they're source separated because we're asking the waste generator to sort them out into the right fractions. We also have technologies where we can have facility separated waste where we'll use machinery and personnel to sort them out, but those are less efficient than doing it right at the source and result in more contaminated waste. So better to do source separation, and here are some common source separation fractions we have. So in our green bin, we have source separated organic waste, or SSO. We also frequently have leaf and yard waste separate from our SSO. So there's a bundle of sticks here you can see in the picture, or you might have a truck that comes by and just sucks up leaves from the curb. And then we've got our recyclables. So in this picture, you can see a gray bin. It says paper items only. You might have a 1 bin or a 2 bin system, depending on where you live, but we do take those out of the other streams and divert them and do other things with them. One that's not pictured here is HHW, or household hazardous waste. Usually there's a collection like once a month or a few times a year. That's for things like e-waste and batteries that shouldn't be going into some of those other waste streams. Contamination is something I just mentioned. So contamination is when we have our source separated streams, which we want one type of waste in, and they get other types of waste in them that we don't necessarily want. So the whole point of source separation is to appropriately deal with a certain stream of waste. And when we have contamination, then it makes it harder for us to do that. So in this picture on the slide, there's an organic waste receptacle, and it does have a lot of organic waste in it, but there's all sorts of other stuff as well. So if we wanted to make compost out of that, we're not going to be allowed to put it on anyone's fields anywhere, because it's just going to end up getting into our food system where we don't want it. So it's really important to reduce contamination in all our source separated streams, and we'll talk about that as we get into each of those topics individually. Contamination will often express as a % weight or as a % of contaminated containers. So 10% of containers were contaminated, or the waste was by whole 2% contamination or something like that. Another term related to just different categories waste is residuals. So residuals, like the word means left over. So anything that's left over after a separation or a processing operation is called residual. So it could be you sort all your waste at home and what's left goes into your mixed waste. That would be your residuals. It could be at a compost plant. They do some pre-processing of their material, and anything that they don't want to put in the compost that they've removed, that would be their residual. So it's just things that don't fit in other categories. And it's always good to find categories where things can be appropriately treated rather than just having them as a residual, because if it's just a residual, it's going to go to a landfill or incineration. It's not going to go to a higher purpose. So in the picture, this is just a label on a waste container. So there's like a vacuum bag, a shoe, a brush, a razor. So these are all things with like a bunch of different materials glued together. They're not really useful to put into any one process. They're hard to deal with. Those will often end up in the residual and not in the dedicated stream.